Good morning, good morning, everybody. I am super excited. My name is Rich Wall Street Williams. You already know, and May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Mindset is something that I'm personally passionate about. I firmly believe that our income and our outcome is greatly determined by who it is that we decide to become. Right. And so all of these things I believe shape our mindset, shape our environments, help shape us, etc. And I had Mr. Thomas Skeeter on today. Mr. Skeeter has been on with us before. I'm not going to steal any thunder from him. He is going to introduce himself, tell us about some things you've been doing. Uh, Thomas, thank you so much, man, for joining us this morning.
Hey, Rich, first of all, man, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to
Okay.
get together with you and to raise awareness and share information about mental health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Thomas. Who you are, what you do, how can people get in contact with you, all of that great information.
Okay, well, first of all, who I am, man, at the core, I'm just a servant. And God has allowed this to be an area of ministry for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I have been doing this work in and around mental health since about 2008.
Mm-hmm.
My clinical title is a mental health therapist at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I work with the Cystic Fibrosis Wellness Team.
Mm-hmm.
But then in private practice, I work with individuals and adolescents and children. My specific area of concentration is on the family. So my theoretical
Mm-hmm.
foundation, it was called family systems theory, which is something that was developed by a gentleman named Murray Bowen. And then I'm
Mm-hmm.
currently doing a program at Georgetown University where we're starting to study and uncover some things dealing with early childhood mental health.
And that sounds fantastic. And so, earlier when I reached out to you, you had mentioned about, anxiety and some of the
Mhm.
coping strategies that you have. So, just kind of unpack that a little bit as it relates to anxiety. I mean, what is that anxiety? How does it show up? Things like that.
No, okay, so very good. So first of all, anxiety is clinically defined as excessive worrying.
Mm,
It can be assessed and it can be determined by having increased muscle aches and soreness, impaired concentration,
mm.
irritability, difficulty sleeping, fatigue, and restlessness. And all these symptoms, they should be going on for probably in excess of about 6 weeks.
Wow. And so, and when you say going on for 6 weeks, you're saying this is happening in me and I don't know it, or unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so you may or may not be aware of all the symptoms because you may have normalized them. But in
Mm,
terms of doing some diagnostics and some assessing, we're looking for
hmm
these behaviors not to be acute, which is happening, at a very distinct start and a very
hmm
distinct end. But we're looking to
hmm
see how they, occur and then how you're experiencing them. So some people could be experiencing anxiety and having experienced it since childhood and not even be aware of it.
Oh wow, that far back.
Hmm.
And yet you word caught my attention. You said normalizing it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so go ahead, go ahead. Normalize. What does that mean?
Yeah, so when we normalize a behavior, one of the things that we do is like it doesn't set off a trigger in the way that it probably once would, or if we were at a level of healthy functioning, we wouldn't recognize it. So like we've
Mm,
normalized it. So like I'll give you an example. So I shifted to a plant-based diet after November of 2021, and as you can see, I've slimmed down. I mean, I'm looking better, feeling better than I've ever felt. But
looking
one of the
good.
things that I had experienced prior to that when I was still eating animal proteins was some level of indigestion from time to time. And so,
Hmm
like, because I didn't know what it felt like to digest a meal and not have indigestion, I kind of normalized the experience. Where it's like if I have a steak, I'm just going to experience some level of indigestion. Whereas now that I'm plant based and I don't have indigestion anymore, if I do experience it, it will stick out to me as something different from my normal and healthy functioning.
Okay, okay. So and then you mentioned about this anxiety, not looking at it, and I believe the word you used was acute, meaning if I'm understanding you correctly, there's a start point, there's an end point. But
Hmm.
you're saying this is something that could go back to childhood.
Yeah, that's right. And so The opposite of acute is chronic. And so the word
Okay.
chronic is something that means that it's happening on a continuum over an extended period of time. So there are some people who
Mm-hmm.
have chronic anxiety because it's
Mm-hmm.
not event related and it's not something that is happening in a very short period of time in a, in a like, okay, I'll give you an example. Let's say for instance, if you and I are driving over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, there are people who may feel a little anxiety behind the wheel as they're going over the bridge, but then as
Mm-hmm.
soon as they get back to firm land, the anxiety goes away.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that it has a starting point and an ending point. There are some
Mm-hmm.
people who experience anxiety where they don't remember where it started and they're constantly going through it. So that excessive worrying is just a behavioral language. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
those behavioral languages are transferred to us generationally.
Mm. So if I'm having anxiety and I'm not aware of it and I don't know where it came from, is that where some of the coping strategies, or is there something that you would advise or counsel or direct me on to do first before we get to actually coping or strategies?
Well, the first thing that we would want to do is get to the root of what the anxiety is stemming from. So the question that
Mm-hmm.
I would ask you would be, okay, can you identify what triggers your feelings of anxiety? And so like I'll
Mm-hmm.
give a personal example. I came from a family of people who worried a lot. And it was something that had been passed on from generation to generation. Now, some
Mm-hmm.
of it was because of the experiences that we had in the United States, particularly being in the southern region of this country, where it created a level of anxiety and worry because of our environment. And so, one of the things that happened is that that worry was then transferred generationally as a
Mm-hmm.
way that we dealt with things. And so not even recognize, you could live a life without worrying about, when where the next meal was coming from, not worrying about, if I go out the house is somebody gonna snatch me, not worrying about, having access to, the best health care. Like those things have been passed on generationally. And so what ended up happening was it just became a way of being, or what I like to call our family's behavioral language. And so when I actually went to therapy, I started doing some internal assessing of my own, as well as working with a therapist. I began to identify like how those thoughts that I was having, they were unhelpful, but they had been programmed into me.
Wow. So I mean, programming. you know,
Mhm.
I got all kind of stuff going through my head right now, man. So you're saying things that,
Mhm.
so there, these are things that have been programmed into us. Programming as a result of our environment or information or words or language. I mean,
Mhm.
what are some of the ways that these things are programmed into us?
Well, like I'll give you an example. So you and I are the same generation. You remember about 20 years ago when you and your wife were having a date night, you'd have to rush home
Hmm.
on Friday. You would go to a store, it was called Blockbuster Video. You'd have to have a
Right.
video card. You'd have to get there early enough so you would get at least one copy of the latest movie that you and your wife wanted to see. Then you'd have to
Right.
stand in the line. You'd have to scan your card. You'd have to pay for it. You'd have to rent it. Go home and watch it. And then you had to have that movie back to the store by like Sunday. And if you returned it without rewinding it, you would have to pay an additional fee. But we were programmed to do that. Now, the minute
Okay.
Netflix came out and shifted from sending CDs in the mail to being able to stream, did you ever have the need to go to Blockbuster again?
No, not at all.
When's the last time you rewound a video?
Blockbuster.
Yeah, do you even have a VHS in your house anymore?
I do. I don't. I don't.
Yeah, you don't. And so that was something
Interesting.
that was that was a tool that was reflective of the times that we were living in. And
Hmm.
so, very similarly, just like how we don't go to the Blockbuster store anymore, now we
Hmm.
have the availability to be able to say, hey, look, this way that we're doing things, it hasn't been working for us for a while. What are some
Mm.
things that we could do differently?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were talking about Blockbuster, while you're talking, I'm going through my head and my experience. I'm like, man, that was a lot of work.
That was a lot of work to watch one movie. Yeah, that was
To
a lot of
watch.
work.
That was a lot of work, and I can understand. I remember one time, we're watching the movie. I'm telling my wife, we got to get this done because I got to get back before the store closes, and then you got to take. Oh man, so yeah, interesting, man. And it that raises another, to me, a situation where there's sometimes there's a programming that's happening to us that someone else
Hmm.
is doing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, like, one of the biggest things that going to therapy and focusing on your mental health does and it allows you to get to a space where you begin to look at like the different things that stimulate responses to you. And so,
Hmm.
like, you may begin to identify like there are certain triggers, and triggers are defined as people, places, events, or feelings that lead to
Mm.
some type of unhealthy response. So you can have a negative trigger that leads to an unhealthy response, or you can have a positive trigger that leads to a healthy one. So triggers can be healthy and unhealthy depending upon how they impact you.
Okay, and that's interesting. So, um, give us a couple of, if you can, some
Mhm,
examples of maybe a positive trigger or healthy. I
mhm,
think is the word you use, healthy and or
mhm.
unhealthy triggers.
Okay, yeah, and so depending on the person, like so for instance, there are certain people when I listen to them, like you and I, we have the same pastor. Whenever
Mm-hmm.
I'm under the sound of his voice, it's a positive trigger for me because I know the information that I'm getting is life altering in a positive way. So
Mm-hmm.
if let's say if I'm having some feelings of negativity or maybe a little uncertainty, I may go to SOFCC TV, shameless plug there, on YouTube and watch one of his sermons. And
Right.
that'll trigger me into the right state of mind just by
Mm-hmm.
listening to them for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then, if I
Right.
listen to the whole thing, I feel full enough to then be able to go face what I'm dealing with. So it may be prayer or listening to, a spiritual leader. Another
Mm-hmm.
healthy trigger can be walking. So, like in terms of our bodies and how we're set up physically, like all of our nerves, they terminate in our feet. And so there's a
Mm.
healthy response to heel striking. And so that's one of the things Dick Gregory talked about the importance of working. If you think when
Mm-hmm.
God had designed the human body, like the car hadn't been invented yet. And so like
Mm-hmm.
we were predetermined to be mobile. And so like
Mm-hmm.
movement has medicinal processes for us. So movement. So I
Mm-hmm.
said prayer or spiritual leadership, movement,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
hydrating, water. If you think about us as a people, there are some people, they're not triggered by water, they're actually soothed by it. So they can go sit by the ocean, go sit by the lake, go, put their feet in the pool, and it has a
Mm-hmm.
relaxing impact on them. So those are all things that are what I would consider to be positive triggers.
Okay. And what about some examples of some negative triggers?
Yeah, negative triggers. Okay, so some negative triggers can be people. So just like how
Mm.
we have our pastor who could be a positive trigger. I'll never forget, I had one patient who said her mother was a negative trigger because every
Mm-hmm.
time her mother called her, she would critique the daughter in a way that would make her feel less than about herself. And then there
Mm.
are some people who, when they use a certain tone, so let's say, for instance, if their tone is heightened or if they're doing what we call yelling,
Mm-hmm.
that can have a negative impact or a negative trigger. I had one patient that I was working with one time. He was a substance use person, challenges with substance use, and he said
Mm-hmm.
McDonald's bathrooms were triggers for him because that's where he would OD at. And anytime he
Mm.
would go into a McDonald's bathroom, it would have a negative impact on him. There's another person that said Pennsylvania Avenue in Baltimore, negative trigger. Why? Because that's where, when I was in the life, I would always go and use. And then once the gentleman
Mm-hmm.
had gotten clean, he said whenever he would drive on Pennsylvania Avenue, he either would have to have somebody in the car with him or get off of it as soon as possible so those feelings wouldn't arise and overtake him.
Mm. Now, an interesting point. Um, what if I'm that person and I identify, these negative trigger, whether it's a gentleman, Pennsylvania Avenue or the McDonald's bathroom? Are there things, Thomas, that I can do now that I recognize it that I can overcome that, or do I have to just avoid that?
No, no, no. So abstinence is one way to deal with it, what you talked about in terms of avoiding it, but also setting
Mhm.
healthy boundaries. And so like
Okay.
the word boundary is important because that's our way of saying, okay, I have to put in something, some restraint when I know enough is enough. And so like for
Mm.
instance, if I set a healthy boundary, what I'm going to say is, okay, when I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue, either I got to have somebody with me or I can only drive on here for a couple of blocks and I got to get off of it. Like that's a
Okay.
boundary. And so one of
Okay.
the things that we have to do is identify how these things are impacting us and then set a boundary.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, and I guess I was thinking, so that is healthy. So setting a boundary, whether it's
Mm.
it's it's having someone in the car or getting off a couple. I'm only going
Well,
to
well,
drive on the
well,
street.
well, I'll give you an example. So I have a
Okay.
cousin who he also was on a wellness journey and he started before me. And so one of the things that he told me is he said, I don't eat in any restaurant that has a drive-through. And it was like, wow, that was, what I mean? Like that was impactful to me because that eliminates a whole lot of selections. But
Yeah,
what that
right.
was actually him setting a boundary and say, hey, if they have a drive-through, I'm not going to be a participant or a customer there.
Interesting. And so, and obviously, you've done work in the workplace.
Mhm.
Let's pretend we're in a workplace. Maybe I'm either a supervisor or an employee.
Mhm.
How do you set up boundaries if you are either you're as an employee, you're in an environment where maybe the leader isn't as the emotional intelligence isn't as high as it needs to be. How do I interact? How do I set up those boundaries properly in a workplace?
Well, the first thing is to be able to observe the capacity of the individual that is triggering you. So, I mean,
Mhm.
we got to be honest. Being in relationship with some people is like hugging a cactus. So, the closer I pull them into me, the more painful it becomes. So,
Wow.
we have to determine like the capacity of the individual. And if the individual has demonstrated the capacity just to have negative triggers, then what we
Mhm.
need to do is keep all of our interactions with the person at a professional level. And then,
Mhm.
like, we need to limit our expectations because one of the things that creates anxiety is when we have expectations for a person, place, or event that are not in
Mhm.
alignment with what they really are or what the event really is.
Interesting, interesting. So, and that could be a key, right?
Mhm.
I'm using the word key. You may use a different word in terms of coping. And if it's in a workplace, setting that boundary. And you said the capacity.
Yeah, capacity. So the capacity is the ability of an individual or person or a thing to meet a certain criteria. So,
Okay.
like for instance, okay, I'll give you an example. If you and I go to KFC, and I don't know why I'm bringing all these restaurants up. Like I told you, I'm plant-based now, so it must be something subconscious. But let's say you
Right.
and I go to KFC, they don't have the
Right.
capacity to give us a hamburger. So, like,
Right.
if we go to KFC and expect a hamburger, we're gonna be frustrated. Why? Because they just don't have those in here. And I don't
Yeah.
care, how many KFCs we go to, how much time we spend in there. Like, you're just not gonna get a burger from there. And
Right.
so there are times where we're in the workplace, personal relationships, we're in school, academic relationships,
Hmm.
we're dealing with neighbors, where our expectations they can exceed what a person's capacity is. And then when our expectations are not in alignment with capacity in that space, in that continuum, that's where anxiety resides because our brains are trying to make it congruent that our expectation is in alignment with capacity so we can get a result.
Interesting. And so when and you and I connected a few weeks ago, you mentioned about some of these coping. I'm using the word coping strategies. I'm not sure if that's the word that you would use. So how
Mhm.
do we then with this anxiety? What are some you shared some? Are there some additional things that we can do to help cope?
Absolutely. So there are multiple coping strategies, but I'll mention a few today. So, for
Okay.
instance, one of the coping strategies that is fairly common and something that's available via YouTube and other channels is what's called
Mm-hmm.
progressive muscle relaxation, where
Mm-hmm.
we take, let's say, like maybe 5 minutes and we do a full body scan. And this is internal. And so we'll
Mm-hmm.
start at the crown of our head and we'll do a scan all the way through the soles of our feet. And we'll look for where the tension is in our bodies. And so, like for me, when I'm leading myself through a progressive muscle relaxation exercise, or
Mm-hmm.
when I'm leading somebody else through one, they can pick up on, okay, here's where I feel the tension. For me, normally I have a lot of tension in my neck and my shoulders because I'm always at my desk and my computer. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I do my progressive muscle relaxation scan and I feel that tightness, that tells me, you know what, you need to get move around a little bit because you're sitting at the computer for too long. Tightness that you're feeling is your body's way of telling you, okay, you haven't moved enough today. So like that's one. So progressive muscle relaxation. Another one is
Okay.
called guided imagery. And so guided
Mm.
imagery is normally where you can log on, you can watch a video, and it may take you to a place like let's say for instance, Rich, if I was to ask you, I want you to now take 5 minutes and go back to the last beach vacation you and your wife had. Can you hear
Mm-hmm.
the ocean coming into the stream? Can you smell the salt in the air? Do you remember what it tasted like when y'all had the virgin pina colada? Notice I said virgin pina colada because I know the type
Yes,
of man
sir.
you are. So, um, do you remember that? Do you remember how cool the
Right.
glass was in your hand? Okay, I want you
Uh-huh.
to spend some time there. And it's basically using your mind as a tool to take you back to a place where you were relaxing. And you're
Mm.
doing that as a way to begin to offset feelings of anxiety and return to us in solitude. So the first one was progressive muscle relaxation. The second one was guided
Mm-hmm.
imagery. Now another one is a term. It's called mindfulness. And
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness is not being tethered to the past or not being overly anticipating about the future, but it's about being in the moment. So, like right now,
Mm-hmm.
you and I were on a restream video. We're talking about mental health. I'm not thinking about going to Costco. I'm not thinking about the traffic that I fought, on my way back from dropping my son off at school. I'm not thinking about what I have to do this evening. I'm
Mm-hmm.
fully engaged in the moment. And by being fully engaged in the moment, I can be fully present. And by getting into a space where we're fully present, that also relieves anxiety because the human brain was not built to determine the future. It wasn't determined to, it wasn't built to predict the future. What it was built was to be able to process truth in the moment. And so
Mm.
even though we can have visions and visualize for things in the future, like we can't get to the space of processing the future. If we do, sometimes that distance between where we are in the present and processing the future will have some anxious impacts on us because our brain will be trying to figure out things that it hasn't had to deal with yet. And it's
Oh,
like I have,
interesting.
yeah, one of my favorite uncles, man, he told me, he said, uh, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. The only day that belongs to you is today.
Yeah.
And so it's like, getting in the present is another coping strategy because sometimes, like, we can be in May right now and people already worried about what they're going to buy the kids for Christmas in December. Now, you can get that far ahead of yourself. And it's like,
Wow.
well, I
Wow.
don't even know what's going to happen between now and December. For all I know, I could come into a contract and we could all be in Jamaica for Christmas. It may not even be about the gifts under the tree. But if
Right.
I
Right.
allow myself to be so caught up in that, then what'll happen is I won't be present minded or present focused. And then I'll
Mm-hmm.
begin to have all these anxieties because I'm trying to predict the future and I'm trying to jump to conclusions, which are
Mm-hmm.
unhelpful thought patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. From a business perspective, I do business development and consulting sales aspect, and what I'm hearing is there seems to be maybe a fine line between being mindful, right, being in the moment, and the brain not being able to predict future events, but at the same time, from a business, there's forecasting, right, there's goal setting, there's
No, I
and
love that.
so being able to, from what you're sharing from a healthy perspective, to be able to say, yeah, you can do that, but here's what you want to be careful about on it.
Well,
Does that
well,
make
but here's
sense?
here's the key for forecasting. So when we're in business and we're doing forecasting and goal setting, we're actually setting something down the road that's going to determine our behaviors today.
Okay.
So the reason why businesses do that is because we want to adjust our behaviors in the current moment. So like let's say for instance, if we have a forecast where we want to do $2 million in revenue by December 2023, but in order to do $2 million worth of revenue, we got to make 200,000 sales calls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what the forecast is saying is that starting today, May 18th, we got to start knocking down these 200,000 phone calls. And if we get the 200,000 sales calls in and we complete the sale, then we'll get to our 2 million in revenue that we're predicting. But what,
Right.
what we're doing when we forecast is what we're saying is if we do these behaviors today, they should result in us getting here. When
Okay.
we try to predict the future, what we say is, man, I wonder what it's going to take for us to get 2 million in sales. That's different from forecasting because
Right.
there's not the accompanying behavior in the present to go with it.
Okay. That's good. That's really good, man. So, we got a couple minutes left. So can you just summarize, the anxiety, some of the coping mechanism, and then always, man, let us know how we can get in contact with you if we need to get set up some of those sessions that you talked about.
Yeah, no problem. So, first of all, when we talk about anxiety, a large number
Mm-hmm.
of the population experience it at some time or the other. There are some
Mm-hmm.
people who experience it in the short term, like we talked about, but there are some people who have been chronically anxious and may not be aware of it. What I do is I work with individuals, families, groups, organizations, sports teams. I've worked with teams in the NCAA. I got some professional athletes that I work with. And what we do is get them in a position where they can begin to think about what they've been thinking about. And then it's interesting when you can get to that space, you can separate out your unhelpful thoughts from your helpful thoughts. And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I do is that I work with people to begin to look at their mental health. And we do what's called mental health hygiene, where we're able to then say, hey, look, here's the things that you've been thinking. Either they're not grounded in anything rational or they're the byproduct of a behavioral language that's no longer serving. So that would be just like me saying, okay, we gotta go drop these videos off at Blockbuster. It's like, boy, ain't even no Blockbuster to drop them off at anymore. Like it just is, it's not a possibility. And so there are some
Right.
people where their thoughts are tethered to a way of being that doesn't even exist anymore. And we need to be able to
Mm,
bring our thoughts into the present and to get in alignment with what our truth is and how we determine our truth. And we set what our truth is. And so, like if I tell you, no matter what happens, when we come in and we meet, you're gonna get a good outcome. And you're
mhm,
gonna determine how good it is based on the things that we're able to accomplish. Then that's us setting the ground rules and setting the groundwork for us to make
mhm,
change. And so we're constantly evolving. One of my favorite rappers, Rakim, he said constant evolution causes expansion. And so just
mhm,
like the universe is constantly evolving, as participants in the universe, so are we. And we have to
mhm.
understand that the only thing that's constant in life is change.
Okay, fantastic, man. I appreciate it. So, how can people reach out to you um,
Yeah,
to get
absolutely.
some more of
So
this information? Maybe set up some sessions.
mhm. Yeah, people would like to set up sessions. I'm currently putting groups in order for September. I'll be working
Hmm.
with not only adults, but adolescents, couples. So you can reach out to me. The phone number to reach me directly is 240 uh, 532 And
Hmm.
it's a number that will go directly to my phone. I'll get your messages. Or you can send me an email. And my email address is the number three, Skeeter, Skeeter, at milestones, MILESTONESMH, which stands for mental health, LLC.com. And all you got to do is reach out to me. I'll have my staff contact you to set up an initial consultation. We'll talk for about 15 minutes about what you're facing, and then we'll put some strategies in place for you to get some treatment.
Man, that sounds fantastic. As always, man, it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I know from a man perspective, male perspective, it's something that have embraced. It's natural. I don't necessarily want to say natural, but it's part of my personal healthy development. And so I just
Yeah.
encourage everyone, reach out to a professional like Thomas. He's on LinkedIn. Are you on Facebook or Instagram as well?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. So I'm on Facebook, Thomas E. Skeeter the third, and then my IG for milestones is milestones underscore um, MH underscore LLC. And so you
Okay,
can find me there. And if you need direct message me there, I'm receiving direct messages as well.
awesome, awesome. I appreciate it again, man. It's always a pleasure. For me, I believe that believing that you can is always more profitable than believing that you can't. Thank you so much for spending
Mhm.
time with us, Thomas. Thank you so much, everyone, for logging in with us. I'll see you next week. Thank you. Have a fantastic week on purpose.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rich. Y'all be blessed.